Spiritual Direction from Dante, Avoiding the Inferno, a book by Father Paul Pearson of the Oratory. Canto 17. Topics: Fraud and Isolation, Work as an Element of Human Perfection, and Trusting as we Step into the Unknown. Many works of fiction begin with the premise of nothing being really as it seems. Whether they are stories of espionage and counter-espionage, conspiracy theories, or science fiction like The Matrix, the characters struggle to tell which way is up and whom they can trust. How do we function in a world where our perceptions and the underlying reality do not seem to correspond? Every action is fraught with complications. We do not need to enter a parallel universe to experience this dizzying confusion, because such is the world of fraud. And how do we communicate with liars? How do we connect with traitors? Fraud turns the world into an isolated chaos in which it is every man for himself. In line 10, Geryon is the very picture of fraud. The face of an honest man, united with the body of a serpent, and the offspring of the father of lies. Dante says, his paws were furry to the shoulder tops, displaying to us his willingness to use brute force, if necessary, to attain his ends. The swirls of colors decorating his body, aside from the association with Islam, which Dante subtly includes, are probably intended as a sort of distraction, almost dizzying in complexity, like the scheming of the fraudulent man or the misdirection of the close-up magician. They might also serve as a sort of camouflage, like the markings on a snake's skin, allowing him to blend into his surroundings unnoticed. In line 22, the predatory beaver is a bizarre and unexpected image, but the point of the imagery is clear. Geryon has his belly on the edge of the cliff, like beer-drinking Germans leaning on the bar, and he's hiding his dangerous parts out of view. If Dante and Virgil weren't some distance away, they would never have witnessed anything but the kindly face of the beast. Hanging off the edge is his venomous tail. What you see is definitely not what you get. What is presented or promised, which is the honest face, is merely a front for the evil scheming of the fraudulent man, which is the sting at the end of the tail. This dichotomy between what is apparent and what is under the surface will be a recurrent theme for all of the cantos on fraud, in fact, for the rest of the Inferno. Having come to the end of the stream's bank at the waterfall, where the river pours into the pit of the fraudulent, Virgil and Dante walk along the cliff's edge, obviously protected from the burning sands by the stony verge. In order to approach Geryon, and Virgil has yet to explain to Dante why anyone would want to do that, they'll travel along the edge, meeting that final group of sinners in this circle, the usurers. Again, before we are told who these sinners are, Dante prepares our mind with his imagery. Virgil goes to haggle with the beast, anticipating the financial misdeeds of the souls. Dante goes off to meet. Again, even before we are officially informed who these sinners are, the imagery has already given us a clue. Note that Geryon, the symbol of fraud, is going to be their means of transport to the bottom of the cliff. The fraudulent make a career of manipulating others for their own ends. Here, Geryon is the one being used, and for God's end. In hell, professional users get used. How often is Dante not only allowed, but even commanded to go off on his own, without the guidance and protection of Virgil? But here, that is exactly what happens. And what is the significance of that? Perhaps it has something to do with Dante's own financial struggles, After all, his property was confiscated at the time of his exile from Florence. Has he had bitter dealings with moneylenders before? This is something that Virgil wants him to face alone. In line 46, the tone of pity for their sorrowing streams of tears is quickly pushed aside by the comparison with flea-bitten dogs scratching and biting themselves. Whatever pity Dante felt for those he knew among the Sodomites is noticeably lacking here. We were intended in the Garden of Eden to work. It is part of our perfection and our dignity. Adam was given the task of tending the garden when he was still in paradise. Work was part of his blessedness, not a punishment. Original sin is not the reason we have to work. It merely made our work toilsome rather than personally rewarding. Our work is intended to be a sort of personal expression. We place our mark on the world by what we do or make. What we are inside is expressed by what we do outside. Our Lord even worked with St. Joseph at Nazareth. Work is holy, and work helps us to be fully who we are intended to be. In line 52, the faces here are unrecognizable. It is as though their sin has sapped their humanity. How often have debtors wondered whether their lenders had a human heart? Symbolically, Dante answers the question negatively. They aren't allowed a human identity. In modern terms, we see how businessmen often hide their cruel decisions behind company policy. This lack of individual identity might also have a deeper source. As we shall see, these men have rejected the human labor that would have completed their humanity. These souls, by lacking their proper labor, lack their own distinct individuality. Here, the only mark of identification is their family seal, a sort of corporate logo. These were company men, through and through. Dante will later specify the various families in Florence who were stained by this sin. Everyone would recognize them by their coat of arms. The sinners have these family money bags slung around their necks like horses with their feed bags. Like gluttons staring at their food, each user seems to gorge his eyes upon that feast. And rather than exerting themselves or making something of themselves, they fed themselves off the wealth of their families and off of other people's labor. Their passivity is not something upper class. It makes them beastly rather than fully human. In line 67, a proud member of the Scrovegni family tells Dante, "Get lost." Despite their lack of any personal accomplishment, despite the obvious fact that they are condemned to hell, these souls are contemptuous in their treatment of Dante. They've always viewed other persons as merely means to an end, an opportunity for profit. They acknowledge neither their own dignity nor that of others. But this soul from one of the good families of Padua shows himself to be anything but noble. His sin has made him beastly, with him sticking out his tongue like an ox. And we've already seen them compared to flea-bitten dogs. Their beastliness is a sign of the violence they have shown to their own nature, their humanity. These souls are violent against human nature, which is supposed to sustain itself, and make a profit, so to speak, by using its own talents, by its own labor. The parable of the talent shows us what God expects of us. We've been given talents in order to make use of them. Turning money into a means of making more money denies the necessity and value of human industry. Look back at the discussion of the nature of usury when Virgil was explaining the organization of hell to Dante in Canto 11. Human industry is called the grandchild of God. God is the maker of all things, pure actuality. We, made in his image, his children, are called to imitate him in his activity. Our work is intended to be our child, and hence, God's grandchild. We are fruitless if we do not produce something by our labor. We should mention that Dante seems to be stricter than St. Thomas about whether any lending of money at interest was usury. St. Thomas recognizes that lending does involve risk and that risk should be compensated. But to take advantage of another's need in order to charge as much as one can get away with is clearly usury. I'd be tempted to put some owners of places specializing in payday loans and perhaps even some big banks with their credit cards here, too. Trusting in God each moment of our lives and cooperating with the graces He sends us can lead us to places we never intended to visit. Once we start listening to God in our hearts, He keeps moving us further and further from what we find comfortable. St. John Paul II gave us the text Duc in Altum as a motto for World Youth Day in Toronto 2002. It comes from Luke 5:4, and it says, "Put out into the deep. Push away from the familiar shore without fear of what lies ahead, confident that God will provide for your needs abundantly." Dante now realizes that he's going to have to ride Geryon. Virgil is already mounted, waiting for him to finish his discussion. Again, Dante is reminded of the need for courage. And he says to Dante, "Be fearless now and strong." Dante is shaken in his boots with fear. It is only the fact that Virgil is between him and that venomous tail, and the thought of the shame he would feel in Virgil's presence if he tried to back out, that make him obey. Even then, when Dante tries to ask Virgil to hold him tight, his voice just won't come out. Virgil, however, knows his need for encouragement and provides it, without Dante having to put his humiliating neediness into words. It's a lovely picture of how God provides for our needs, even when we are unable to give voice to them. Imagine the natural fear rising up within Dante. He is on the back of the monstrous Geryon. This beast has just pushed himself off the cliff, and Dante must have felt what a first-time passenger feels when a plane takes off. And Dante can see nothing all around him. The pit into which he is descending is in darkness. The only way he knows he's even descending is by the feeling of the air blowing against his face. The image is one of absolute trust. He is entering a dark pit. Virgil is holding on to him, and that is all he needs to know. For the Christian, our awareness of God's presence and His providence should provide the same consolation and confidence. Canto 18. Topics: self-defensiveness in a harsh world, sex and deception, using sex as a means of manipulation, and flattery, a costly exchange. Fraud or dishonesty in all its forms breaks down our connection with one another, in our families, and in society as a whole. We learn from painful experience that we cannot trust others. We view them as competitors, adversaries, even enemies. This awareness produces in us a self-defensiveness that in turn leads us to isolate ourselves increasingly from one another. We end up surrounded by people, but somehow very alone. But to the eyes of those affected by fraud, that sadly is the way things appear. Both those who practice fraud and those who are on the receiving end of it develop a bunker mentality. In line 1, they are arriving at the pit of fraud, and we recognize that even the terrain is different here from what we have encountered in the upper levels of hell. The circles of the passionate and the violent were flat terraces. Here, where fraud is punished, there are 10 malabolge, literally, evil pockets or pouches. These malabolge are stone trenches that run all the way around its circle, like the dug-in trenches famous in the First World War. Together, these trenches form a series of concentric rings around the central and final pit of hell. There seems at least 2 different ways to think about this shift in the geographical imagery. The first interpretation follows from the nature of the sin of fraud. Since fraud is based upon a sort of deception, a false face, it takes place underground, underhandedly, covertly, out of sight. They have thrived in hiding. And second, we can think of the Malebolge in their relation to Satan himself. In the same way that a medieval city has outer walls protecting the gardens, inner walls protecting the houses, and a moat and walls protecting the citadel or stronghold, so Satan's city, the opposite of the city of God in heaven, has the outer gates, broken and off their hinges after our Lord's death, the city walls of the city of Dis, and now these moats leading into the deepest pit of hell. The Malebolge are Satan's inner defenses. His moats are manned by his most faithful troops, the followers of the father of lies. The iron-colored stone suggests the coldness of the heart of the fraudulent. Ezekiel 36:26 says, I will take from your flesh the heart of stone. Their sins were not driven by their passions here. They did evil in a cold-blooded way. In line 14, there are small stone bridges, rock ribs, running over the Malebolge that will allow Virgil and Dante to pass over these trenches on their journey to the bottom. In his poem, Marmion, Sir Walter Scott wrote the immortal words, Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. Sinful human beings will use almost any sticky material to construct their web, whatever will attract and hold their prey. From the beginning of recorded history, we have exploited sexuality as a ploy for achieving other hidden ends. Our sexuality is at the very core of our humanity. It is a powerful drive, and one that is easily manipulated. Interestingly, the souls in hell are sometimes specifically identified as nude, as they are here. I don't suppose the others actually have clothing. Dante does explain the appearance of bodies and even clothing in Purgatorio in Canto 25, but here they appear naked as a symbol of their sins, pandering and seducing, that is, leading people into sexual sins either with others, which is pandering, pimping, or with oneself, seducing, both of which actions are types of fraud. These related sins account for the two-way traffic in this trench. In line 35, we see devils with horns, which is often a sign of lust, and are whipping the sinners with thick whips as they themselves used their reason to drive others into sexual sins. Here, the sinners are on the receiving end. Notice an interesting shift. Sometimes the sin itself is the punishment, like the suicides. And sometimes the sin, which the sinner inflicted upon others, is turned upon himself. A taste of his own medicine. These sinners used the sexual desires of others to entice them into sin, and driving them on, manipulating them with the whip of desire. That desire, the most powerful in our human nature, usually receives a swift response, just like the souls here, who respond immediately to the first strokes of the whip. In so many cases, repeated temptation is not necessary. The very first one receives its response from our disordered nature. In line 46, notice how the souls try to hide. Hiding is part of fraud, and being exposed means failure. It is only against my will I tell. Dante reminds us of the very core of fraud when he says, if your face and its features aren't false. The man should hide, given that he used his own sister to lead someone to sin sexually. Being recognized by Dante, which is the equivalent of being pulled out of a lineup, is certainly part of his punishment. Using sexuality as a means of getting what we want is a very different sin from lust. The lustful soul desires the pleasure of the sexual act, but the one who exploits it is looking for something else. The sex is merely the bait. This sort of manipulation is not a function of human weakness, but of calculating wickedness. The real object of desire is what sex will bring to them: money, power, or status. In line 63, Benedico reveals the underlying motivation of his pandering: avarice. He was merely using sex as a means to attain wealth. And the horsewhipping demon won't let the souls talk their way out of anything or pretend to be something they aren't with, "Off with you, pimp. We're no whores for you to swindle here." Again, exposure is part of their punishment. There is nothing that was hidden that will not be exposed. In hell, the subterfuges of the fraudulent are dragged into the light of day. Deception or hiding the truth is not permitted. It is from the arch of these bridges, or preferably from the far side of the Malebolge, which is significantly lower, that Dante observes the sinners. Until now, Dante and Virgil have been walking only in one direction, and so have seen the faces of only one half of this two-way procession of sinners, the panderers. And as they get atop the bridge, they look in the other direction and see the parade of seducers, moving briskly along, also driven by the whips of the demons. We should not think that the seducers are merely prostitutes and courtesans. These are certainly included, but this circle punishes all of those who have used sex as a tool. Among those be many men who have loved them and left them. They have promised love for sex only to renege on the promise once they've gotten what they wanted. Jason is one of those. Seducers go with him, all liars. That's enough for you to know of this ditch. There is no romanticizing of the sin of seduction. This is not a matter of love in excess, or even of sexual desire in excess, as was the case with Paolo and Francesca in the circle of the lustful. That is wrong, but understandable given the weakness of our human nature. This sin is about lying in order to get what is desired. The lie of seduction is not merely the words that are used to convince the victim to commit sexual sin. That can be part of it, but not all of it. But it's the very act of sex itself. Sex is supposed to be a sign of commitment to one's spouse, a way of communicating an exclusive and inseparable bond. The truth of sexual relationship is violated here. The sex itself becomes a lie, an idea that the modern world would, unfortunately, barely understand. What is being presented as the false face here is the bond of love, but casual sex for the sake of money or influence is the ugly reality behind that face. Human language is seen by many scholars as a special sign of our developed rationality. Words provide us a way of communicating with one another, of sharing the truth I have in my mind with someone else. The wonderfully powerful tool of language makes society possible. It also opens up the possibility for literature. But our words can be used as deceptive bait too. We can abuse this precious gift and use it as a way to get what we want. Some people have a gift for saying the right thing to win over others, whether what they say is true or not. Flattery has become a lucrative art form, but at what cost to our human dignity? In line 103, from what we can see of the people in the next Malebolgia, we can conclude that they are in a sad state and seem to lack any sort of self-respect. And it says, we came upon people who whimpered, sniveling, runny-nosed, who slapped and smacked themselves with open palms. They seem to be like the poorest of the poor, unhealthy, whining, hitting themselves like a crazy street person. Any sense of dignity has been lost long ago. And their surroundings match their personal state. They are in the bottom of what could best be described as a latrine, growing with fungus and mold, like a toilet that hasn't been cleaned in decades, and sending off a smell that says, making a nauseous brawl with eyes and nose. It's hard to tell whether the sight or the smell is worse. The toilet imagery immediately becomes more obvious when they say, I saw people plunge deep in just the sort of dung you dump from human privies and latrines. The reason for the mold, fungus, and noxious odor is now obvious. These souls are wallowing in excrement. In life, these flatterers were masters of BS, and now they swim in it. Their own sense of dignity didn't hold them back from saying whatever would please the rich and famous, making sure they were allowed to remain in their exalted presences. They were courtiers, frequenting palaces, and now their surroundings have changed. Or perhaps the reality of their lives has merely been revealed. Here, human conversation, speaking the truth, and the social bonds of affection and loyalty are the false face that fraud offers to the world, with ambition and greed, the ugly reality hidden behind. And line 133, Deus is in the second trench because even though she was a prostitute, she also flattered her lover, praising his sexual abilities. But why is her flattery worse than her seducing? Because the words of truth are more fundamental than pledges of love. We are right to be suspicious if someone offers that sort of commitment. Such a bond requires special discernment. We should, however, be able to trust the word of those around us. Without that, society has become unsocial, because truthful communication is the foundation of our social nature. Remember, Dante's criterion for ordering these sins is how profoundly they deform our humanity, not how much external damage they do.